Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So I want you to imagine, just for a second, scrolling through your professional network online right now. What do you actually see?
Oh, I mean, it's an endless parade of just meticulously curated success, right?
Exactly. Everyone is, celebrating a new milestone or announcing a promotion. They're hiding their failures behind these polished PR-managed statements and basically just trying desperately to look completely invulnerable.
Yeah, because we live in a culture that is utterly terrified of weakness, like absolutely terrified.
Right. If you admit you're struggling or, if you show a crack in the armor, the assumption is just that you are losing the game.
Which is really the modern obsession with this impenetrable facade.
Yeah.
We want the resume, not the reality.
Yeah, we want the aesthetics of success without the messy, bleeding vulnerability of actual human experience.
And that is exactly why the material we are diving into today feels like an absolute shock to the system.
It really is. So we are taking a custom-tailored deep dive into the first 6 chapters of this really ancient text, the second letter to the Corinthians.
Written by the Apostle Paul.
Right, Paul. And our mission today is to act as your guides, pulling out the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and just the profound life application from what is honestly one of the most raw, emotional, and totally counterintuitive documents from the ancient world.
It's incredibly raw. We're going to look at how this ancient framework approaches suffering, conflict, identity, and, integrity.
And the wild part is how aggressively it just completely dismantles our 21st century obsession with looking perfect.
Yeah, but to truly grasp why this text is so jarring, we have to look at ground zero. Where did this letter actually land?
Right, the city of Corinth.
Exactly. Because if we just read these words in a vacuum, abstracting them into neat little theological bullet points, we totally miss the absolute chaos of the environment Paul was writing to.
So set the stage for us. What was Corinth like?
So Corinth was the capital of Achaia in the 1st century. And it was basically the ancient equivalent of Las Vegas, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley, just all mashed into one geographically strategic bottleneck.
Wow. So it was essentially a massive boomtown.
A huge boomtown, yeah. It sat right on an isthmus, which meant that all the maritime trade flowing east and west was dragged directly through its center.
Which means money. Lots of money.
Incredible wealth.
Wow.
Highly competitive and famously cosmopolitan. You had sailors, merchants, freed slaves making new fortunes, and philosophers all just colliding.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it was characterized by aggressive upward mobility and, frankly, intense moral fluidity. The culture of Corinth valued charisma, wealth, powerful rhetoric, and status above almost anything else.
Okay, so this is an audience that fundamentally respects the winner. Like, they want the guy with the most polished resume and the loudest voice in the room.
Exactly. And Paul's writing to this specific community of early Christians he helped found, but he's carrying a mountain of personal baggage.
Right. Like a lot of baggage.
First, he has recently survived a horrific traumatic event in Asia Minor, which we'll definitely get into. Second, he is actively defending his own integrity against a very vocal, very polished group of rival leaders.
The ones often called false teachers, right?
Right. And they have infiltrated the Corinthian community. These rivals are playing the Corinthian status game perfectly.
Like having the perfect LinkedIn profile.
Exactly. They have impressive letters of recommendation, they speak beautifully, and they're actively mocking Paul. They're telling the Corinthians, look at Paul. He's suffering, he's weak, he changes his travel plans, so he's obviously fickle.
Oh, that's brutal.
They're saying he's unimpressive. Why are you listening to a loser?
Man, the anxiety of leadership right there. That is heavy.
It's deeply personal. And on top of defending his life's work, Paul is also trying to manage the fallout of a very painful, very public disciplinary crisis within that same community.
Right, which we'll talk about later. So this is not a detached academic textbook. This is a bleeding, urgent letter from a leader who is just desperately trying to hold a fractured community together.
And his own sanity, honestly, under immense pressure.
Yeah. So before we really start pulling this apart, just a quick note for anyone listening. This text makes deeply religious, cosmic, and theological claims. It is a foundational document of the Christian faith.
Right.
But our goal on this deep dive is not to force agreement or to preach or demand that you adopt the specific theology. Our goal is to impartially explore the fascinating psychological mechanisms, the radical viewpoints, and the ancient wisdom contained in this original source material.
We want to lay out the architecture of Paul's thought process.
Exactly, so you can take these insights and test them against your own modern realities. So speaking of the architecture of his thought process, that is actually a great place to start.
Yeah, because the way he opens this letter defies literally every rule of public relations.
Oh, totally. Because if you are a leader under fire, if people are calling you weak and unimpressive, the standard playbook says you open with a show of strength.
Right. You list your victories, you project confidence.
You fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
You assure the board of directors that everything is totally under control.
But Paul does the exact opposite. He starts in the absolute depths of human despair.
It's wild. He opens by talking about being utterly crushed.
And this introduces a concept we can call the alchemy of affliction.
Yeah.
Which is how ancient wisdom attempts to transform the way we view and utilize our own suffering.
This is chapters 1 and 4, and I find this framework incredibly challenging because in my own life, when I hit a wall, when I suffer a major setback or go through a dark period, my immediate instinct is to find the exit door as fast as possible.
Of course, you want the pain to end.
I want it to end, and once it ends, I want to never, ever think about it again. But Paul's opening argument completely reframes the utility of pain.
He begins by identifying the divine as the Father of mercies and God of all comfort. But he immediately attaches a mechanical purpose to this comfort.
A mechanism. Unpack that.
The text argues that the primary reason we receive comfort during our darkest trials is not simply to soothe us. It isn't just about feeling better so we can go back to our comfortable lives.
Right.
The mechanism is that we are comforted so that we can comfort others who find themselves in similar trouble.
So it's not a dead end. It's a conduit. The comfort is literally supposed to pass through you.
Exactly. And Paul grounds this in a terrifyingly specific experience. He isn't speaking in platitudes here. He reminds the Corinthians of an affliction he faced in Asia, likely during the riots in Ephesus.
Which was really bad.
The historical context suggests a massive, violent civic uprising against him and his companions. And the language Paul uses in the source material is just devastating.
Yeah, what does he say?
He says he was burdened out of measure, above strength. He writes that he despaired even of life. He had the sentence of death within himself. He was entirely convinced he was going to be executed or torn apart by a mob.
Let's translate the gravity of that to how we handle mental health, resilience, and trauma today. Because when you survive a season of severe burnout or a crippling bout of anxiety, maybe the loss of a business or deep personal grief, society often gives you this implicit and sometimes explicit message.
Which is basically heal up, put it behind you, and return to normal.
Right. Get over it is the underlying mandate.
Uh-huh.
We view trauma as a permanent stain on our record, something to be minimized and hidden.
But Paul's looking at his own near-death terror and suggesting a radical alternative.
Mm-hmm.
He's suggesting that the trauma you survived is actually your ultimate credential.
That is the alchemy right there. The pain ceases to be a meaningless void that you simply fell into and had to crawl out of.
Right, it becomes a curriculum. The historical commentary we are looking at points out that Paul's sufferings were viewed as a necessary preparation.
So sustained by this divine comfort, he gained the raw, undeniable personal experience required to guide others.
Because you cannot lead someone through a minefield if you have never stepped foot in one yourself.
Yeah, you can't just read a book about suffering and then try to coach someone who is bleeding out. They won't trust you.
And they shouldn't trust you. And Paul captures this dynamic brilliantly in chapter 4 with a metaphor that is literally echoed through the centuries.
Ah, the earthen vessels.
Yes, he talks about having this profound treasure, this divine light, this truth housed in earthen vessels.
Which are basically cheap, disposable clay pots, like the kind of pottery you'd use for everyday chores, maybe even for garbage, and then you just shatter it when it got too dirty.
Exactly. The contrast is intentionally stark. The priceless, eternal contents are held within a fragile, mundane, entirely unimpressive container.
When I try to visualize this for a modern context, I always think about data storage. So imagine someone hands you a cheap, battered plastic USB drive.
Okay.
It's scuffed, the cap is lost, maybe it went through the laundry once and the plastic is all cracked. It looks like absolute garbage. You'd probably throw it away if you found it on the street.
Right, it looks worthless.
But coated inside that fragile, ugly little plastic shell is the access key to a cryptocurrency wallet holding $10 million.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The value of that object has absolutely nothing to do with the plastic shell. The shell is weak, it is easily broken, it is totally unimpressive. All the value is in the unseen code inside.
That's a great way to put it.
So Paul is essentially saying to the Corinthians, yes, your false teachers are right. I am a battered, cracked USB drive. But you are obsessing over the plastic, and you are completely missing the fortune inside.
That analogy hits the core of the text perfectly, because it forces a total reevaluation of weakness. And this is where the text offers a really profound comparative insight against other philosophies, both ancient and modern.
Like what?
Consider Stoicism, which was prevalent in the Greco-Roman world, and is experiencing a massive resurgence today in corporate culture and self-help circles.
Oh, absolutely. The modern tech bro stoic aesthetic, ice baths, emotional detachment, building mental calluses.
Right. And Stoicism has immense value in teaching resilience. But its core mechanism often relies on emotionally fortifying the self against the outside world.
Building a wall.
Yes, it advocates building an impenetrable inner citadel so that external pain, loss, or humiliation simply cannot disturb your tranquility. You literally train yourself not to feel the weakness.
Okay, so how does Paul differ from that?
Paul's framework in Corinthians goes in the absolute opposite direction. He advocates for fully feeling the reality of the earthen vessel.
He isn't trying to pretend the clay pot is made of iron.
Exactly. He argues that recognizing and leaning into our absolute lack of self-sufficiency, admitting that we are fragile, that we break, that we despair of life, that is the precise condition that allows the divine power, the treasure, to actually be seen.
So the cracks in the clay pot aren't flaws to be patched over with positive thinking or stoic detachment. The cracks are literally the design features that let the light leak out into the dark room.
He states explicitly that he received the sentence of death in himself, so that he would not trust in himself, but in God, who raises the dead. The weakness is the necessary conduit for the strength.
So think about your own life for a moment. Think of the absolute hardest season you have ever survived.
Yeah.
The bankruptcy, the divorce, the depression that kept you in bed for a month, maybe a public failure. We spend so much energy trying to hide those chapters.
We really do.
But who in your orbit right now is entering that exact same dark woods? Because if Paul is right, your specific scar isn't a liability. It is literally the only map out of the woods that the person suffering will actually trust.
Because they can see you survived it.
Right. Instead of hiding the cracked clay pot, the challenge is figuring out how to use the light spilling from your own fractures to show someone else that survival is possible.
And that requires a vulnerability that the competitive world of Corinth, and let's be honest, our world completely despises.
Oh, absolutely.
But this vulnerability doesn't just apply to how we handle external suffering, like mobs in Ephesus or corporate burnout. It applies even more intensely to how we handle conflict from within our own ranks.
Which brings us to a fascinating shift in the text. We move from surviving external pressure to navigating internal betrayal. Let's look at chapter 2 and what we might call the architecture of forgiveness.
Because being attacked by a nameless mob is terrifying, but being betrayed or undermined by someone sitting in your own living room, someone in your own community, the psychological damage there is just so much deeper.
It is entirely destabilizing.
It really is. And to understand Paul's instructions here, we have to look back at the history between him and the Corinthians.
Right, the prequel.
Yeah, in his previous correspondence, what we know as 1 Corinthians, Paul had to confront a massive scandal. There was a man in the Corinthian church engaging in a moral failure so severe, so shocking, that even the pagan Roman culture around them found it offensive.
Which is saying something for Corinth.
Right. And the church was just ignoring it. They were tolerating it, perhaps out of a twisted sense of open-mindedness or simply conflict avoidance.
Which honestly happens all the time in modern organizations. A high performer is incredibly toxic or abusive, but the leadership turns a blind eye because confronting it is just too messy.
Exactly. So in the first letter, Paul played the heavy. He instructed the community to excommunicate the man.
To remove him from their fellowship.
Right. It was severe disciplinary action designed to protect the integrity of the community and to serve as a harsh wake-up call for the offender. It was a form of tough love, a social isolation meant to induce shock.
Okay, so they kick him out. They establish a hard boundary.
Right. But here in the 2 Corinthians, we get the follow-up. And it turns out the severe discipline actually worked.
Oh, wow.
The commentary and historical analysis note that the man was humbled. He felt the weight of his actions, and he genuinely repented. His heart changed. He wanted to make amends.
So what does Paul do?
Well, now, Paul's tone completely flips. The core wisdom he delivers in chapter 2 is a desperate, urgent plea for the community to pivot. He tells them to forgive this man, to comfort him, and to actively confirm their love toward him.
Why the sudden change?
Because Paul warns that if they continue to ice him out, if they keep punishing him after he has repented, the man will be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow. He will be utterly destroyed by despair.
Right, I have to pause here and just push back a little bit because I am looking at this through the lens of 2026, where we have highly sensitive, highly publicized conversations about accountability, abuse of power, and, cancel culture.
Right, it's a very touchy subject today.
Very. If someone commits a severe community-damaging offense, doesn't rushing to forgive them just because they said, I'm sorry, let them off the hook way too easily, doesn't welcoming the offender back into the fold endanger the community and insult the victims?
That's a fair question.
It feels like prioritizing the feelings of the guilty party over the safety of the group.
And that is the exact tension of this passage. And it's why distinguishing between genuine accountability and punitive malice is so absolutely crucial. The text isn't advocating for a cheap, immediate amnesty where actions have no consequences.
Okay, so the consequences still matter.
The consequences already happened. The punishment, as Paul notes, was inflicted by the majority and was sufficient. It wasn't swept under the rug. The discipline acted as medicine for a disease.
So it did its job.
Exactly. The issue Paul is addressing is what happens after the medicine has worked. The goal of the discipline was humility and restoration, not permanent destruction. Right. The wisdom here requires discernment, recognizing the precise moment when justice has actually achieved its goal. If you continue to administer harsh medicine after the disease is cured, the medicine itself becomes a poison.
That makes total sense. Keeping someone ostracized after genuine transformation is no longer about community safety. It morphs into vengeance.
Precisely. It stops being about protecting the boundaries and starts being about enjoying the power of punishing someone else.
That's dark.
It is. And Paul identifies a massive, counterintuitive obstacle to growth here. He warns the Corinthians that if they refuse to forgive, if they hold on to this punitive, rigid stance, they're actually allowing Satan to get an advantage over them.
Okay, let's unpack that mechanism. Satan to get an advantage. Setting aside the theological personification of evil for a moment, what is the actual psychological and communal mechanism happening there? How does holding a justified grudge give darkness an advantage?
Think about what a grudge feels like. When someone deeply hurts us or hurts our community, holding a grudge feels incredibly protective.
Yeah, it feels safe.
It feels like strapping on armor. We tell ourselves, I will never let them close enough to do that again. It gives us a sense of moral clarity and superiority. We are the righteous victims, they are the irredeemable villain.
Right.
But the text claims this armor is actually a trap. When a community collectively refuses to forgive a truly repentant person, the internal culture of that community begins to rot. It becomes characterized by suspicion, rigidity, and fear.
Wow, so the armor turns into a straitjacket.
Yes. The scholars analyzing this text point out that an unforgiving posture makes the community appear harsh, cruel, and severe to the outside world.
You think you're keeping the bad guy out, but you're actually locking yourself inside a prison of your own resentment. You completely lose your capacity for empathy.
And you lose the core identity of the community itself, which, in Paul's view, is supposed to be grace. If the community is defined by its rules and its punishments rather than its capacity for restoration, it has entirely lost the plot. The grudge isolates you.
Bring this down to the ground floor of our own lives. Most of us aren't managing the excommunication of a community member, but we are definitely managing interpersonal betrayals.
All the time.
So is there someone in your life, a friend, a sibling, maybe an ex-business partner, who genuinely caused damage, but who has also genuinely apologized? They have done the work, they have changed their behavior, but you are still keeping them in the penalty box.
You bring up their past failure in every argument.
Exactly. You use their old mistake as leverage to maintain control in the relationship. The challenge Paul throws down is to ask yourself, are you holding the boundary for safety, or are you holding the grudge because you just enjoy the moral high ground?
That's a tough question to answer, honestly.
It is. If the repentance is real, the practice is to release the penalty. Take off the straitjacket and confirm the love.
which is incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah.
Because releasing that penalty means giving up our primary method of measuring our own superiority.
Right, our leverage.
And that segues beautifully into our third major theme. If a community is supposed to be defined by this radical, vulnerable grace, rather than its strict adherence to the rules, how do we prove our worth?
Right, how do we establish authority or measure success if we aren't using the standard metrics?
Exactly. This brings us to Chapter 3, a section we can frame as resumes versus reality, or the theology of the letter versus the spirit.
I love this section because we are basically diving into the ancient version of LinkedIn and verified blue check marks.
That is an incredibly accurate parallel. The historical context here revolves around a very specific status game the false teachers were playing in Corinth.
Okay, tell us about the game.
In the Greco-Roman world, if you were a traveling philosopher, an orator, or a teacher, you couldn't just show up in a new city and expect people to listen to you. You needed proof of your legitimacy.
Of course.
So they carried letters of commendation. These were formal letters of recommendation written by wealthy patrons, prominent politicians, or established leaders in other cities. It was their paper credential.
It's the Ivy League diploma on the wall. It's the as featured in Forbes badge on your website.
Exactly. It proved you were part of the elite network. And these rival teachers arrive in Corinth waving these impressive letters, and they look at Paul, who's battered, bruised, and carrying no such paperwork.
They're like, where's your badge, bro?
Yeah, they demand, where are your letters, Paul? Prove you have the right to speak to us.
And Paul's response is just phenomenal. He essentially looks at the system, laughs, and refuses to play the game entirely.
He really does. He doesn't scramble to get his own letters from Jerusalem to match theirs.
But
he makes this audacious claim.
what does he say?
He says he doesn't need letters written with ink on papyrus. He points directly at the Corinthian people themselves and says, "You are our epistle, written in our hearts, known and read of all men."
It's a brilliant rhetorical maneuver. He shifts the entire foundation of validation. He says, the proof of my leadership isn't a piece of paper signed by a VIP. The proof is your transformed lives.
Yes.
The fact that this chaotic pagan community has been changed by the message I brought, that is the only resume that matters. It is a living document.
Think about how aggressively this challenges our modern credentialism.
We are so obsessed with the paper trail of our worth. We spend our 20s accumulating degrees, our 30s chasing job titles, and our whole lives cultivating a digital footprint that screams, I matter, look at my endorsements.
Right, we want the metrics to prove our value before we even step into the room.
Yeah.
But Paul is arguing that your true resume is never what is written about you. Your true resume is the actual, tangible, human impact you leave in your wake.
It really is.
If you want to know if a manager is a good leader, don't look at their MBA, look at the team they manage. Are those people thriving? Are they growing? Or are they terrified?
Yeah.
The team is the letter.
It's the difference between claiming value and actually embodying it.
Yeah.
And Paul uses this specific conflict over letters of recommendation to launch into a massive, sweeping comparative insight between two entirely different ways of approaching life and relation to the divine.
Okay, here we go.
He contrasts the Old Covenant, which he associates with the law of Moses, and the New Covenant, which is the way of the Spirit.
Okay, we need to slow down here and do an ELI 5 explain. Like, I'm 5 because to anyone who isn't steeped in ancient theology, Old Covenant and New Covenant just sounds like really heavy religious jargon. What are the actual mechanics of what he's talking about?
Let's break it down into the mechanics of human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Paul describes the law of Moses, the Old Covenant, as being written and engraven in stones.
Like literal stone tablets.
Right. It is external. It is a set of rules. Do this, don't do that. Keep these days holy. Don't eat these foods. Don't steal. And Paul calls this system a ministration of death and a ministration of condemnation.
Wow, calling the foundational law of his own heritage a ministration of death is a massive, highly controversial statement. Why does he use such dark terminology for something that was supposed to be good?
Because of how an external rule functions psychologically.
Yeah.
A law, by its very nature, can only diagnose failure. It cannot provide the cure.
Give me an example.
Think of a speed limit sign. If the speed limit is 65 miles per hour and you are driving 85, the sign does its job perfectly. It tells you that you are breaking the rule. It condemns you. It makes you guilty.
Right.
But the sign has absolutely no power to reach into your car and press the brake pedal for you. It demands a standard of perfection, but it offers zero internal power to help you achieve it.
That makes a lot of sense.
Therefore, an external system of rules ultimately only leads to condemnation, because human beings will inevitably fail to keep the rules perfectly.
So if you build your entire identity around being a perfect rule follower, you are setting yourself up for crushing anxiety, because the moment you slip, the stone tablet just crushes you.
Exactly. Now contrast that with his description of the new covenant, the gospel. He calls this the ministration of the Spirit. And crucially, he says it is not written on stone, but on the fleshy tables of the heart.
So it's basically an internal operating system update.
Yes, it is a shift from external behavioral compliance to internal identity transformation.
Interesting.
Under this system, you aren't doing the right thing because you were terrified of the stone tablet smashing you. You are doing the right thing because your fundamental desires have been altered by the Spirit. The power to change comes from the inside out.
It offers life rather than merely diagnosing death.
And he uses this incredible historical imagery regarding Moses to illustrate how stubborn we are about clinging to the rules. He talks about Moses coming down from Mount Sinai after receiving the law, and Moses' face is glowing with this terrifying divine glory.
But Paul adds a fascinating detail there, doesn't he?
He does. He says Moses put a veil over his face, not just because the light was too bright, but to hide the fact that the glory was actually fading. The old covenant was temporary. Its glory was passing away.
And Paul applies that veil metaphor to his current audience. He argues that when people continue to read the ancient texts merely as a strict rule book, as a ladder of performance they must climb to earn worth, that same veil remains over their minds.
Yes, they're blinded to the reality that the system of external rules is a dead end. They can't see that the true, enduring glory is found in internal transformation.
As Paul famously writes here, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. It is a profound liberation from the exhausting, crushing weight of trying to justify your own existence through perfect performance.
It really is.
So let's turn the mirror on ourselves for a second. If your life is an open letter, constantly being read by everyone around you, your kids, your employees, your partner, what is that letter actually communicating?
That's a convicting thought.
Are you operating your home or your business under a system of strict, condemning rules? Are you constantly trying to prove your worth with external metrics, judging others the moment they fail to meet your standards?
Or are you operating under a system of liberty? Does your life communicate internal transformation, grace, and an environment where people are free to grow rather than terrified of breaking a rule?
Are you just a polished piece of paper, or are you a living letter of liberty? It is the ultimate diagnostic question for a leader.
It really is. And if you genuinely accept this premise, that true reality and true worth are located in this internal, unseen spiritual transformation rather than external physical credentials, it forces an absolute paradigm shift in how you view the universe.
It changes everything.
You can no longer look at the physical world the same way. Which brings us to the fourth section of our deep dive, covering chapters 4 and 5, where Paul explores the concept of the new creation.
This is where the philosophy gets intensely practical regarding the physical reality we live in. Because if we are transformed internally, how does that actually change the way we relate to our physical bodies? How does it change how we view the daily grind, the aging process, and just the people we pass on the street every single day?
Paul takes the lens he just used on his own suffering and widens it to a cosmic scale. He looks at his own physical body, which, as we established, has been beaten, starved, stressed, and is undeniably decaying.
He's been through it.
He refers to the human body as the earthly house of this tabernacle, or simply a tent. Now think about the nature of a tent. A tent is inherently temporary, it's fragile, it offers shelter for a night, but it is ultimately designed to be taken down and packed away. It is not a permanent residence.
Nobody builds a foundation for a canvas tent.
Right. But Paul doesn't fall into nihilism over this decay. He doesn't despair that his physical body is failing, because he contrasts the temporary tent with the promise of a building of God, and house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens.
Because he is absolutely convinced that his core identity is anchored in an eternal reality.
Yes. So he formulates a radical principle for daily living. He says, we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal.
I really want to highlight how deeply countercultural and honestly offensive this idea is to the modern ear. We are surrounded by massive, multi-billion-dollar industries dedicated entirely to convincing us that the seen world is the only world that exists.
Oh, absolutely.
Our culture tells you that youth, physical beauty, material accumulation, and health are the ultimate singular goals of human existence. We have an anti-aging industry that preys on our absolute terror of the tent dissolving.
We view a wrinkle or a gray hair as a failure, a tragedy.
Yeah, the idea of calmly embracing the decay of the outer man because you believe the inner man is being renewed day by day, that is highly uncomfortable for a society that is fundamentally terrified of death.
It is entirely subversive to our modern value system. The commentary we are referencing notes that to act with constant reference to the unseen world elevates the human soul.
How so?
It gives a person a profound, unshakable dignity. If you truly believe your core identity is an eternal building, you are no longer held hostage by the anxieties of the temporary tent. You don't panic when the canvas tears.
Right.
And crucially, this cosmic shift doesn't just insulate you from your own physical decay, it completely destroys the way you categorize other human beings.
Yes, this leads to one of the most explosive claims in the entire letter, chapter 5, verse 16. Wherefore, henceforth know we no man after the flesh.
To understand the weight of that sentence, you have to understand the Roman world.
Lay it out for us.
The society Paul and the Corinthians lived in was hyper-stratified. It was a rigid caste system. You were defined entirely by your fleshly categories. Were you a Roman citizen or a subject? Were you a patrician or a plebeian?
Were you a slave, a freedman, or a master? Were you a Jew or a Gentile?
Exactly. Your entire worth, your legal rights, and your social standing were dictated by these external seen labels.
The ultimate system of judging the book by its cover.
And Paul takes an axe to the root of that entire social order. He argues that because Christ died for all of those old categories are dead. They are obsolete.
He writes, "Old things are passed away, behold, all things are become new. If someone is in Christ, they are a new creature or a new creation. The old labels of status just no longer apply."
The implications of that for our world today are just staggering. Because we pretend we don't have a caste system, but we absolutely do.
Oh, we definitely do. Think about how we categorize people. We look at someone and we instantly reduce them to their fleshly labels. We see their job title, their income bracket, the neighborhood they live in, the political bumper sticker on their car, the color of their skin.
And we make immediate sweeping judgments about their worth based on those temporary external metrics.
Paul is saying that if you view humanity through that lens, you are living in an illusion. You are entirely missing reality. You are looking at the fading tent and ignoring the eternal being inside.
You are operating in the old world, blind to the new creation. To know no man after the flesh requires a radical empathy. It requires you to look past the political affiliation you despise or the socioeconomic status you either envy or look down upon and recognize an eternal soul.
So try this tomorrow. The next time you are sitting in a frustrating meeting or maybe stuck at a tense family dinner, consciously look at the person who is annoying you the most.
Oh, this is a good exercise.
The one whose opinions grate on you, the one whose arrogance or ignorance drives you completely crazy. Just for 10 seconds, mentally strip away all of their fleshly labels. Strip away their annoying job title, their wealth, their politics, the way they talk.
Just strip it all away.
Try to view them purely as an eternal spiritual being, a new creation housed in a fragile, temporary tent, suffering through the exact same messy human condition that you are.
How does that shift change your blood pressure? How does it change your capacity to respond with patience instead of venom?
It demands a level of grace that the natural fleshly world simply cannot comprehend. But this brings up a massive practical tension, and this tension drives us right into our final section, looking at Chapter 6, Boundaries and Integrity in a Messy World.
Right, because the logical pushback here is, okay, if we are these eternal beings, if we are supposed to look past the physical world and operate as ambassadors of this new creation, how do we actually live on a Tuesday?
Exactly. We still have to pay taxes, go to work, buy groceries, and interact with a culture that operates entirely on fleshly, cutthroat rules. Do we just isolate ourselves? Do we retreat into a commune in the woods and refuse to interact with the corrupt world?
That is a very common temptation in religious movements throughout history, the monastic retreat, just separate entirely.
But Paul doesn't do that.
No, Paul's own life, as detailed in this letter, proves that isolation is not the answer. He is intensely dedicated to being an ambassador in the thick of the world.
He is right in the middle of it.
In Chapter 6, he lists his credentials as a minister, and again, they are not a list of comfortable victories. They are a list of extreme hardships endured specifically because he refused to isolate himself.
He talks about being in much patience, in afflictions, in necessities, in distresses, in stripes, which means beatings, in imprisonments, in tumults, in labors, in watchings, in fastings. He is in the absolute mud of human existence.
Exactly. And he summarizes his existence in this beautiful dynamic paradox.
I love this part.
He describes himself and his team as deceivers, and yet true, as unknown and yet well-known, as dying, and behold, we live, as sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, as poor, yet making many rich, as having nothing, and yet possessing all things.
It's poetry.
He is deeply, aggressively embedded in the messy, painful reality of the world, bringing unseen wealth and joy to it, without being defined by its metrics.
But then, right after establishing how deeply embedded he is, he issues this famous, stark command that seems to pull in the exact opposite direction. He says to the Corinthians, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness?"
This is a critical text that requires careful wisdom and discernment.
Because it's misunderstood constantly.
It is one of the most frequently misunderstood and weaponized verses in the source material. It has been used to justify extreme sectarianism, to force people to cut off their non-religious family members, and to create incredibly insular, toxic communities.
So what did it actually mean in the ancient context? Let's look at the imagery first, unequally yoked.
The imagery is agricultural. A yoke is a wooden beam used between a pair of animals like oxen to allow them to pull a load together.
Right.
To be unequally yoked means harnessing two different types of animals together, say an ox and a donkey, to pull a plow. The problem is they have entirely different gaits, different strengths, and different temperaments.
If you yoke them together, they won't plow a straight line.
Exactly. They will pull in different directions, they will chafe and injure each other, and they will end up going in exhausting circles. The work won't get done, and both animals will suffer.
So, applied to human relationships, does this mean a Christian can't be friends with an atheist? Or that you have to quit your job at a secular tech company because your boss doesn't share your faith?
Not at all. The historical and theological commentary we are relying on is very explicit here. It notes that Paul's command does not mean believers should become monks, live recluse lives, or sever civil and social ties.
Because Paul himself didn't do that.
Right. Paul himself engaged with pagan philosophers in Athens and made tents with non-believers. You can, and absolutely must, engage in commerce, science, civic duties, and neighborhood relationships.
So where exactly is the boundary line drawn?
The line is drawn at the level of core principles and ultimate allegiance. It means drawing a hard, non-negotiable boundary at participating in the values and the destructive behaviors of the surrounding culture.
What would that look like in Corinth?
In the context of ancient Corinth, being unequally yoked meant a Christian going to the pagan temple feasts and participating in idolatry, or adopting the cutthroat, unethical business practices that were rampant in the city's markets.
Okay.
You cannot enter into a binding partnership, whether a business venture, a marriage, or a deep alliance, where your fundamental moral compass must be compromised to match the pace or direction of someone pulling toward darkness. You cannot plow a straight line of integrity if you are yoked to someone whose goal is corruption.
Let me try to lock this concept in with a modern analogy. Think of it like a submarine.
Okay, submarine. Where are you going with this?
So a submarine's entire purpose, its fundamental design, is to be in the water. It is built to leave the safety of the dry dock, dive deep into the dark, freezing, crushing pressure of the ocean, and operate in that hostile environment.
Right.
If a submarine sits on land its whole life, it's useless. It belongs in the deep water. But there is one absolute rule.
The water can't get inside.
Exactly. The moment the water gets inside the submarine dies. It loses its buoyancy, it loses its power, and it sinks right to the bottom.
That perfectly captures the paradox Paul is describing.
You are meant to be in the world. You are meant to dive deep into the messy, dark, complex reality of human society, the corporate boardrooms, the political debates, the broken neighborhoods, to be an ambassador of light.
But you have to keep the water out.
Yes. The moment the world's corruption, its greed, its malice, its fleshly metrics, its need for ruthless self-promotion get inside you, you sink. You lose your integrity. You lose your ability to be a new creation because you are filled with the old water. You are in the water, but the water cannot be in you.
And that requires constant, vigilant maintenance of your boundaries. You are yoked to your mission, not to the destructive currents of the culture surrounding you. You must engage the culture without being assimilated by it.
So think about your own submarine. Where in your life are you currently unequally yoked? Where is the dark water leaking in?
That's a great question to reflect on.
Are you compromising your deep moral integrity just to fit in with a business partner whose ethics are, frankly, shady, but who makes you a lot of money? Are you altering your core values to maintain your status in a social circle that thrives on gossip, exclusion, and cruelty?
Or perhaps you were in a romantic relationship where, deep down in your gut that you are pulling toward light and growth, and they are entirely committed to pulling toward dysfunction and darkness.
If you are chafing against the yoke, where do you need to seal the hatch to save the ship?
Evaluating our lives with that level of honesty requires immense courage. It requires us to recognize where we have allowed what Paul calls the hidden things of dishonesty to creep into our daily operations.
Yeah, it really does.
But the profound promise of this ancient text is that when we do separate from the corruption, when we seal the hatch against the dark water, we don't lose the world. We actually gain the true liberty required to serve the world as genuine ambassadors.
Let's pull the lens back and look at the massive landscape we've traversed today. We started in the pitch-black darkness of external affliction, discovering the alchemy that turns our shattered, unimpressive clay pots into the exact vessels designed to carry comfort to someone else in pain.
It's quite a journey.
From there, we stepped into the messy architecture of forgiveness, learning that holding a grudge isn't armor, it's a straitjacket, and that releasing the penalty is the only way to save a community from the internal rot of malice.
Then we tore up our letters of commendation, realizing that true validation isn't a polished resume or a stone tablet of rules, but the living, breathing impact of the Spirit on the people around us.
We experienced an ultimate paradigm shift, learning to view our decaying bodies and the people who annoy us the most, not as temporary fleshly labels, but as eternal new creations. And finally, we learned how to navigate a chaotic world like a submarine, diving deep into the mess to bring light, without ever letting the corrupt water inside.
When you lay it out like that, the architecture of Paul's thought is just staggering. He moves seamlessly from the depths of solitary personal trauma to a sweeping cosmic view of human identity, and grounds all of it in the gritty daily reality of how we treat our neighbors.
It's incredible. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, connecting the very beginning of our deep dive to the end. Connect the fragile earthen vessel back to the concept of being an ambassador of the new creation.
Okay.
We spend a massive percentage of our waking lives trying to fix our flaws. We go to therapy, we read self-help books, we try to hide our traumas, and we frantically polish the outside of our clay pot so we look strong, put together, and marketable to the world. We literally beg for the cracks to be glued shut.
We do. We hate the cracks.
But what if the exact weakness you are so ashamed of, the specific trauma you survived, or the deep, lingering vulnerability you've been begging to have removed is actually the precise earthen vessel that gives you the empathy, the specific vocabulary, and the authentic authority to be a true ambassador of reconciliation in someone else's life?
What if your darkest, most broken moment is the exact necessary lens through which someone else can finally see the light?
If that is true, then your weakness isn't a liability on your resume. It is your ultimate credential. That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.